Congresswoman Crockett, your policies are nothing but reckless experiments that endanger the very soul of this nation. The words tore through the chamber like a thunderclap, sharp and dismissive, dripping with the authority of a man who had spent decades wielding power without question. For a moment, the echo of Mitt Romney's attack seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Lingering like smoke after an explosion, the Senate chamber froze. Cameras locked in. A room filled with lawmakers, aides, and reporters suddenly transformed into a stage where every breath mattered. Even the clicking of keyboards stilled as America leaned in, watching, waiting. Romney leaned back, confident, almost smug, as if his statement had closed the case before it began. His eyes narrowed at Jasmine Crockett, daring her to fold under the weight of his words. To him, this was just another performance, another chance to belittle a rising progressive voice. But to the millions watching, it was something far greater. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her silence heavier than any rebuttal Romney had expected. The tension in the room became unbearable, like a violin string pulled to the brink of snapping. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a collective recognition that this was no ordinary exchange. Something historic was about to unfold. The stakes were unspoken, but unmistakable. This wasn't just about policy lines in a bill or the minutiae of legislative jargon. This was about who gets to define America's future. Those who cling to privilege and power, or those who fight for dignity and inclusion. The chamber's silence spoke louder than Romney's insult. Some senators shifted in their seats, uneasy, sensing a tide turning. Reporters scribbled furiously, eyes darting between Romney's self-satisfaction and Crockett's calm stillness. The cameras zoomed in tighter, capturing every flicker of expression. Every heartbeat of suspense. The world outside mirrored that anticipation. In living rooms, on subway screens, on phones across the country, viewers leaned forward, breath held, knowing they were witnessing the spark of something unforgettable. And then came the moment, the subtle lean forward. The clearing of her throat, the glint in her eye. Crockett was ready, but nobody could have predicted how Jasmine Crockett would respond. The confrontation hadn't emerged from thin air. It began with a debate over a sweeping policy package meant to expand access to affordable health care, strengthen workers' rights, and channel federal investment into communities that had been left behind for generations. To Jasmine Crockett, the bill represented not only a path toward equity, but also a moral duty to those who had spent too long living in the shadows of American prosperity. To Mitt Romney, however, it was nothing less than a dangerous gamble. A reckless experiment, as he had declared, that threatened the sanctity of the free market and the traditions he believed. Kept the nation strong? This divide was more than technical. It was philosophical. On one side stood a seasoned lawmaker, polished by years in the establishment. Cloaked in the privilege of old power, leaning on the familiar rhetoric of caution and tradition. On the other stood a freshman congresswoman whose journey from working-class struggles to the halls of power gave her words the raw weight of lived truth. Crockett wasn't merely arguing policy points. She was fighting for families who rationed insulin, for parents who worked 2 jobs and still feared eviction, for young immigrants who dreamed of belonging in a country that often turned its back on them. The chamber itself became a mirror of the nation's fracture. Some senators nodded along with Romney, eager to dismiss the proposal as idealistic overreach. Others leaned toward Crockett's vision, drawn by her refusal to accept that dignity and health care were privileges rather than rights. Every raised eyebrow, every hushed whisper, underscored that this was not just another Washington squabble. Outside the marble walls, the stakes were felt in visceral ways. In Detroit, a mother waited hours in a free clinic line. In El Paso, a father prayed his child's asthma inhaler would last until the next paycheck. In Appalachia, coal miners' families hoped a federal safety net would finally recognize their decades of sacrifice. These weren't abstract numbers on a budget spreadsheet. They were lives, fragile and urgent, hanging in the balance. Romney's attack, then, was more than an insult. It was an attempt to draw a line in the sand, to paint Crockett as reckless and unfit to shape America's destiny. But in doing so, he revealed something unintended. the desperation of an old guard clinging to power while the ground shifted beneath their feet. His words carried the weight of entitlement, as though experience alone were a license to silence emerging voices. Crockett, by contrast, embodied the opposite. She was new, yes, but new meant fresh, unafraid, unbought. Her silence in the wake of Romney's jab wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was the silence of someone who understood that the eyes of millions weren't watching Romney, they were waiting for her. Every second of that silence deepened the drama. What would she say? How would she defend a bill that promised so much yet carried the label of reckless from a seasoned senator? And more importantly, could her response transform this moment from a clash of egos into a statement about who truly held the moral high ground? The stakes weren't just political. They were personal, national, historical. Mitt Romney's voice had long carried the authority of wealth, privilege, and lineage. Born into a world where doors opened easily, he was the heir to a powerful political dynasty. The son of a Michigan governor and auto executive. From the polished campuses of prep schools to the ivy-draped towers of Harvard, Romney's life had been paved with opportunity. He wore the aura of establishment power like a tailored suit, immaculate, untouchable, and steeped in the belief that leadership was his birthright, that background, however, was both his crown and his blindfold. It gave him access, but it also kept him distant from the grit of ordinary life. In every campaign stump speech, he spoke of hard work, of family, of faith. But his words often rang hollow to those who knew the struggles he could never fully grasp. To many, Romney represented the polished perfection of the American elite. Efficient, pragmatic, but insulated. His political career reflected those contradictions. He was once the governor who had championed healthcare reform in Massachusetts, introducing a state model that would later inspire the Affordable Care Act. But when the tides of partisan politics shifted, so did his tone. He distanced himself from his own legacy, labeling the federal version of the very program he had pioneered as Obamacare, a dangerous overreach. That pivot became a defining feature of Romney's persona, calculated, adaptable, but never truly anchored in conviction, and it was in debates where this pattern revealed itself most starkly. Time and again, Romney positioned himself as the voice of reason, belittling progressives as dreamers who didn't understand the hard math of governance. During the 2012 presidential race, he famously dismissed nearly half the nation's population as dependent on government, a gaffe that laid bare his disdain for those who didn't share his privilege. Though he later attempted to soften the blow, the damage was done. To working-class families, the remark became a window into a worldview where compassion took a back seat to cold arithmetic. The echoes of those contradictions reverberated in every chamber where Romney spoke. When progressive voices rose to demand climate action, he warned of economic disaster. When activists called for systemic reform, he scolded them for impatience. His pattern was consistent: acknowledge their passion, then dismiss their demands as impractical, reckless, or naive. He had mastered the art of polite arrogance. The smile that said, "I understand you," paired with the vote that said, "But I don't believe in you," for Romney. Debates were battlefields where decorum cloaked condescension. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His weapon was the assurance of someone who believed his pedigree carried more weight than his opponent's lived experience. In his presence, younger lawmakers often felt diminished, as if their ideas were trials in a courtroom where he was both judge and jury. But that polished armor also hid deep vulnerabilities. His shifts in position left him open to charges of hypocrisy, eroding trust among conservatives and progressives alike. He was the Republican who broke ranks to vote for Trump's impeachment, earning grudging respect from some, but suspicion from his own base. He was the businessman who claimed to understand the working class but couldn't remember how many homes he owned. Each contradiction chipped away at the image of certainty he projected. Flashbacks to his debates told the story clearly. In 2012, he sparred with Barack Obama, leaning heavily on statistics and market logic, but when pressed on empathy, his answers faltered. In town halls, when single mothers asked how his policies would help them, his words turned mechanical, almost detached. The disconnect was palpable. He could deliver numbers, He couldn't deliver compassion. And now, facing Jasmine Crockett, Romney leaned once again on the same tactics: dismiss, belittle, discredit. To him, she was another idealistic challenger, untested and unseasoned, who could be put in her place with a sharp rebuke. He had done it before to countless opponents, using poise and polish as a shield against their passion. Yet something about this moment was different. Crockett was not rattled. She was not rushing to fill the silence or stumbling over rebuttals. She was steady, her calm presence unsettling in its own right. For the first time, Romney's words didn't close the debate. They opened a chasm of expectation. The room was waiting, not for his next line, but for hers. Romney adjusted his tie, perhaps unconsciously, as the silence stretched. Cameras captured every detail: the tightness in his jaw, the faint twitch of discomfort. His attack had landed, yes, but not in the way he intended. Instead of silencing her, he had set the stage for her rise, and though he couldn't know it yet, the power dynamic he had always controlled was beginning to shift. But for the first time, Romney's polished armor was about to crack. Jasmine Crockett's story was never supposed to fit neatly into the polished corridors of Washington. She was born far from the marble columns and power suits of Capitol Hill. Raised in a world where survival meant resilience and every victory was earned, not inherited. Her childhood was marked not by privilege, but by persistence. She watched her family stretch every dollar, saw neighbors work 2 jobs only to come home exhausted, and understood from an early age that dignity in America often had to be fought for. Those experiences became the roots of her determination. While other children might have been shielded from the hard truths of poverty and inequality, Jasmine was immersed in them. She saw classmates come to school hungry, she watched relatives struggle with medical bills, and she understood the unspoken rules of being underestimated. Rules that came with being a young black woman in a system not built for her. These moments etched into her the conviction that silence was complicity, and that one day she would find her voice loud enough to shake the walls of power. That voice first sharpened in classrooms and libraries, where she immersed herself in the study of law. For Crockett, the law wasn't just an abstract system of rules. It was a tool that could either chain communities or liberate them. She chose liberation. After completing her studies, she did not take the path of corporate firms or cushioned partnerships. Instead, she walked directly into the fire. Defending the marginalized, representing the voiceless, standing beside clients who had no one else to fight for them. Her work as a civil rights attorney was not glamorous. It was exhausting, often thankless, and fraught with resistance. She defended protesters targeted by authorities, young men and women whose only crime was demanding dignity. She challenged police misconduct, exposing systems that had operated in the shadows for decades. Each case carried risk. Each battle left scars. But with every step, she built not just a career, but a reputation. For courage, for tenacity, for refusing to bow to the intimidation of entrenched power. And while Romney's path had been paved with inheritance, Crockett's was cut with her own hands. Grassroots movements lifted her, not party machines. Community organizers, single parents, immigrants, and activists became her allies and her base. Her campaign events were not filled with wealthy donors and tailored suits, but with ordinary Americans. Nurses, teachers, grocery clerks, who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. To them, she wasn't just a politician. She was proof that their fight could reach the halls of Congress. Her credibility was not built in think tanks, but in neighborhoods. She was present at rallies, on picket lines, church basements where community leaders strategized about how to protect the vulnerable. People remembered her not as a distant figure, but as someone who looked them in the eye, listened to their fears, and carried those stories with her into every debate. Each handshake, each shared tear, each late-night meeting in a cramped office gave her authenticity that no title or pedigree could replicate. Yet her journey was not without pain. The slights of racism and sexism shadowed her path, each one a reminder of the barriers designed to keep her out. Colleagues dismissed her, pundits questioned her legitimacy, and opponents painted her as inexperienced or unprepared. But every insult became fuel. Instead of shrinking, she grew louder. Instead of yielding, she sharpened her resolve. These wounds stitched themselves into armor, not the cold, polished armor of Romney's privilege, but a lived resilience forged in fire. What made Crockett formidable was not just her intellect or her eloquence. It was the authenticity of her scars. When she spoke about justice, she wasn't quoting theory. She was remembering clients shackled by systems that had failed them. When she argued for healthcare access, she thought of families forced into impossible choices between medicine and rent. When she called for dignity, she carried the memory of every child, every neighbor, every community silenced or sidelined by power. This identity, unpolished but unbreakable, made her more than a politician. She became a vessel for voices long ignored. Every triumph she carried was communal. Every battle she waged was collective. And the more entrenched figures tried to diminish her, the more her supporters rallied. They understood that her presence in the chamber was not an accident. It was a declaration. America was changing. And so were the faces of its defenders. In the chamber, as Romney's attack reverberated, Crockett's silence wasn't the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of a woman who had endured worse and overcome more. She had been underestimated before, doubted before, dismissed before. Yet each time she had answered not with surrender, but with strength. The weight of her story pressed invisibly behind her shoulders, steadying her for the moment now at hand. Every step of her journey, every childhood struggle, every courtroom battle, every grassroots campaign had been leading to this confrontation. This was not just another debate. It was the culmination of a life forged in resilience, of a voice trained in the crucible of injustice, ready to rise above entitlement and arrogance. And it was precisely this journey that armed her for what came next. The air in the chamber was still heavy from Romney's first strike, but he wasn't finished. His voice rose again, measured but cutting, as if each syllable had been sharpened in advance. "Congresswoman Crockett," he declared, "your brand of politics isn't leadership, it's performance. You stand here promising the moon, but what you deliver is division. America cannot afford reckless ideologues chasing applause while families pay the price." A low murmur rippled across the room. The jab wasn't about policy anymore, it was personal. Romney wasn't just challenging her ideas. He was challenging her very legitimacy, her right to sit among them, her capacity to lead. Cameras pivoted toward Crockett, but she didn't move. Her face remained unreadable. Her stillness unsettling in a space where bluster usually reigned. Romney pressed on, sensing advantage. Experience matters. Judgment matters. I've governed, I've built, I've led. What have you done, Congresswoman, except shout louder than the rest? America needs steadiness, not slogans. The words dripped with condescension, a reminder of his decades in the establishment and his belief that tenure equaled superiority. Yet Crockett's silence only deepened the tension. She didn't bite, didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the space. Instead, she let Romney talk himself into a corner, his voice gaining volume as if trying to fill the vacuum she created. The contrast was stark, one figure loud and defensive, the other steady and poised, waiting. Each insult pushed the room closer to explosion. Senators shifted in their seats. Staffers scribbled notes, eyes darting between the two figures at the center of the storm. The gallery audience leaned forward, sensing the inevitability of collision. Viewers across the country tweeted in real time, clips already circulating, captions screaming about Romney's arrogance and Crockett's composure. Romney launched one final strike, his voice cold. America deserves leaders who think beyond their next viral moment, not politicians who treat this chamber like a stage. He paused, almost triumphant, believing he had delivered the killing blow. But the silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was anticipation. Crockett's stillness had transformed the atmosphere, turning the chamber into a drum-stretched taut, ready to break at the slightest strike. Every second of her quiet was louder than Romney's entire tirade. She inhaled slowly, eyes steady, her hands folded calmly on the desk before her. She knew the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Romney or even the bill under debate. It was about every voice that had ever been silenced, every community dismissed by power, every person told they were too new, too young, too unworthy to lead. Romney sat back, confident he had controlled the exchange. But those who had watched Crockett before recognized the shift in her posture, the spark in her gaze. She wasn't retreating. She was preparing. And then, with the room hanging on the edge of breath, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the mic. Her voice came low at first, steady and deliberate, the kind of tone that forced the room to lean in rather than tune out. "Senator Romney," Jasmine Crockett began, pausing long enough for the silence to press even heavier. "I've spent my life fighting for people who don't have the luxury of dismissing their struggles as theatrics. What you call performance, I call survival." The chamber rustled. Some heads tilted, others nodded. Romney's brow furrowed as Crockett's words sliced cleanly through the arrogance of his attack. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power came from restraint, from the kind of conviction that didn't flinch under fire. "I've represented men and women who were dragged into courtrooms because they dared to demand justice," she continued, her cadence tightening. "I've stood beside families who couldn't afford an attorney when the system came down on them with all its weight. When I look at policy, Senator, I don't see numbers on a spreadsheet. I see the faces of those families. I see the tears of mothers deciding between rent and medicine. And let me be clear, I will never apologize for speaking with their urgency." A murmur rippled through the gallery, the sound of suppressed applause. Crockett's eyes locked on Romney, steady as steel. "You say experience matters? You're right. But experience doesn't just come from boardrooms or governorships. Experience comes from living with the consequences of broken systems. Experience comes from being dismissed, underestimated, told to wait your turn. That, Senator, is a kind of education you cannot buy, no matter how many degrees hang on your wall." Romney shifted in his seat, his practiced calm beginning to fray. He adjusted his tie again, then leaned back, attempting to look unmoved. But cameras caught the tightness around his jaw, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Crockett pressed on, her voice now gaining momentum. "You accuse me of chasing applause? Let me tell you what applause looks like. It looks like a child finally able to breathe because their parents could afford an inhaler. It looks like a veteran walking into a clinic and walking out with dignity instead of debt. It looks like communities, your constituents as well as mine, finally being seen not as statistics, but as human beings." The chamber stirred again, some nodding openly, others glancing nervously at Romney. The contrast was unmistakable. Crockett, grounded and passionate, versus Romney, unraveling beneath the weight of his own entitlement. She paused, letting the silence do its work before lowering her tone, almost intimate, as though speaking directly to the millions beyond the cameras. "What you call reckless, Senator, I call responsibility. What you call division, I call representation. And what you call inexperience, I call courage. Because courage is what it takes to stand here and tell the truth when the easy choice is to stay silent." Cutaway shots captured reactions across the chamber, some senators leaning forward, captivated, others whispering to their aides. The gallery buzzed, cell phones lighting up as journalists and staffers fired off real-time updates. On social media, clips of her opening lines were already trending, hashtags forming like storm clouds. Romney tried to interject, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, not in defiance, but with calm authority. "You've had your turn, Senator," she said, eyes never leaving his. "Now, America deserves to hear the other side of the story." A ripple of gasps traveled through the room. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Firm, unwavering, unbothered by hierarchy, she shifted from rebuttal to vision, laying out the stakes with clarity. This bill isn't about slogans. It's about whether families can see a doctor without losing their homes. It's about whether workers can earn enough to live, not just survive. It's about whether this country will continue to be governed by those who sit in ivory towers or by those who actually know what struggle feels like. Her words landed like hammer strikes, each one connecting with the force of lived truth. Romney sat stiff, staring down at his notes, his composure thinning with every sentence. "And let's talk about leadership," Crockett continued, her voice rising now, not in anger but in resolve. "Leadership is not dismissing the pain of your people. Leadership is not mocking those who dare to dream of better. Leadership is having the courage to look injustice in the face and say, 'No more.' If that makes me loud, if that makes me bold, if that makes me inconvenient, then I will gladly bear those names. Because what this country cannot afford is silence in the face of suffering." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Louder this time, the sound of history being recognized in real time. Some clapped, before quickly stopping themselves, knowing decorum rules. But the energy was undeniable. Romney sat frozen, his earlier bravado crumbling. He had expected Crockett to be rattled, defensive, maybe even emotional to the point of stumbling. Instead, she was unshakable, her words drawing strength from every attack he had hurled. Crockett leaned in one final time, her voice measured, deliberate. "Senator Romney, you can dismiss me. You can dismiss my words. But you cannot dismiss the millions of Americans who sent me here, who are tired of being silenced and who will not be ignored any longer. I do not speak for myself. I speak for them. And their voices are rising." The silence afterward was seismic. The cameras caught Romney's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes betraying the weight of a man who had finally lost control of the narrative. Across the chamber, eyes were on Crockett, not him. On social media, her words were already a tidal wave. Hashtags bloomed. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag dignity speaks. Hashtag truth over privilege. Clips of her calm dismantling spread like wildfire, each replay amplifying the power of the moment. By the time she finished, Romney's silence said more than words ever could. The moment Crockett leaned back from the microphone, the silence inside the chamber gave way to a roar outside of it. Phones buzzed, timelines lit up, and within minutes, hashtags stamped their claim on the digital landscape. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag truth over privilege. Hashtag dignity speaks. The clip of her final line spread like wildfire, racing across platforms faster than pundits could scramble to spin them. Within the hour, the video had racked up millions of views. Memes emerged almost instantly, Crockett's steely gaze juxtaposed against Romney's tightened jaw. Her calm hand raised, mid-sentence, captioned with, "Sit down, privilege." The people are speaking. Activists amplified it, turning the moment into rallying cries. Progressives called it a masterclass in composure and courage. Even skeptics admitted, grudgingly, that the balance of power in that chamber had shifted. News anchors scrambled for airtime. Commentators replayed her lines with reverence usually reserved for presidential addresses. One host declared, "We may have just witnessed the arrival of a new national voice." Another, clearly rattled, tried to dismiss it as political theater. But even as he spoke, the trending feeds proved him irrelevant. What set this moment apart wasn't just Crockett's rebuttal. It was the resonance. People who had never tuned into a Senate debate were sharing her speech on their lunch breaks, texting it to relatives, debating it in classrooms. Teachers paused their lessons to play clips. Community organizers replayed it at town halls. In barbershops and bodegas, the question wasn't, "Did you see it?" but "What part hit you hardest?" Rivals, too, couldn't resist weighing in. Some Republicans dismissed the uproar as overhyped social media noise, but the tremor in their tone betrayed unease. Romney's allies tried damage control, releasing carefully worded statements about respectful disagreement. Yet no phrasing could erase the image of him, silent while Crockett's words echoed. For once, his pedigree and polish had failed to shield him. Meanwhile, progressive leaders seized the moment. Activists stitched Crockett's lines into campaign ads, turning her rebuttal into a movement soundbite. Organizers circulated petitions under banners that read, "Representation is not noise, it's power." Donations surged to grassroots groups she had, mentioned by name, but the most striking response came not from politicians or pundits. It came from everyday people. A mother in Detroit posted a tearful video saying, "When she talked about choosing between rent and medicine, that was my life last year," a veteran in Texas wrote, "for the first time in years. I felt like someone in that chamber actually saw me." Thousands echoed the sentiment, their voices stitching together a chorus of validation. The ripple effect stretched far beyond the U.S. International outlets picked up the story, framing it as a collision between old guard establishment power and a new wave of unapologetic truth-tellers. Headlines abroad read, "Rising Democrat shakes the Senate. Crockett's calm dismantles Romney." The moment had transcended national politics. It was cultural, and yet, beneath the celebration, there was tension. Analysts whispered about the risks. Would Crockett be punished by leadership for breaking decorum? Would donors punish her for humiliating a party elder? Or had she, in that instant, made herself untouchable by sheer force of public support? The night closed with pundits still debating, activists still organizing, and hashtags still climbing. But one truth settled over the entire landscape. This wasn't just a debate. It was a cultural earthquake, the kind of rupture that realigns fault lines for years to come. And yet, the most powerful part was still to come. When the noise of the chamber and the frenzy of the feeds finally settled, the deeper meaning of Crockett's words began to crystallize. This was never just about Mitt Romney. It was never only about a single policy disagreement. What unfolded that day was a living parable about arrogance versus integrity, privilege versus service, and the timeless struggle between voices that seek to dominate and those that rise to dignify. Crockett reframed the entire clash through her very presence. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to match insult for insult. By standing her ground, by weaving the experiences of everyday Americans into the fabric of her rebuttal, she turned Romney's attack into an accidental spotlight on the values that truly matter. The lesson was unmistakable. When arrogance tries to erase, dignity has the power to write history instead. For millions watching, the symbolism was undeniable. Romney, the veteran politician with elite credentials and generational wealth, represented an establishment too often detached from the grit of working families. Crockett, the daughter of struggle, the product of persistence, embodied service rooted in lived reality. Their clash wasn't just political theater, it was America's crossroads laid bare. Which voice deserves the mic, the polished entitlement of privilege, or the grounded truth of a servant leader who carries her community in every word? Her moral clarity pierced through cynicism. "This isn't about me," she reminded the chamber. "It's about the single mother who wonders if she can keep the lights on. It's about the veteran who fought for freedom only to return to empty promises. It's about every citizen who refuses to be silenced." In those words, Crockett spoke directly to viewers who had been underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. She told them, without needing to say it outright, "Your story matters. Your struggle has weight. You are not invisible." And that was the true reversal. Romney's attempt to belittle her became the stage for her to elevate millions. His arrogance had no answer for her empathy. His privilege had no defense against her integrity. By the end, the moral lines were clear. Dignity does not just survive attacks, it transforms them into fuel. Commentators would later describe her performance as historic, but too many, it felt personal. A student in Chicago tweeted, "I saw my future in her." A grandmother in Arizona wrote, "I've lived long enough to know integrity when I see it." Their voices carried the resonance of Crockett's larger point. Democracy isn't secured by the powerful who cling to it, but by the people who demand it live up to its promise. As Crockett left the chamber, the cameras still trailing her, the weight of her words lingered. They weren't confined to the marble halls of the Senate. They spilled outward, reaching living rooms, classrooms, and hearts across the country. In her calm defiance, there was a roadmap. The future doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who stand the firmest. Her words weren't just for the chamber. They were for every viewer who has ever been underestimated, and the echo of that lesson would carry straight into the next battle, where her message would become not just remembered, but acted upon. Mitt Romney attacked Jasmine Crockett. He came armed with sharpened words, polished stature, and the weight of establishment privilege. But in the end, his voice faltered. Her response, measured, unflinching, grounded in truth, left him crushed not by volume, but by the undeniable force of dignity. This was more than a clash between two politicians. It was a reminder of what wins in the long run. Arrogance may command headlines for a moment, but integrity carves legacies. Privilege may try to drown out the people's voice, but service rooted in lived struggle always finds its way to the surface. Crockett proved it in real time. Dignity isn't fragile. Dignity is power, and that's why this story matters beyond the chamber. Because every viewer who has been underestimated, overlooked, or silenced could see themselves in her steadiness. Every person who has felt crushed by systems too big to fight could feel the pulse of resistance in her words. If you believe dignity deserves the mic, share this story. Pass it to someone who needs to know that arrogance never has the final word. And if you believe calm strength always beats noise, subscribe and join this movement. Because what happened in that Senate chamber isn't just history, it's a blueprint for the future. One voice stood tall, one voice cracked. And in that difference lies the lesson. Dignity doesn't just respond, it reshapes the conversation. History is watching. So are we. And together, we'll make sure that voices like Jasmine Crockett's are never silenced again.